certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth.
Sarah Spears, Jane Rimmer, Ciara Glennon.
And every time you saw a young girl walking by, you think, oh God, is she going to be the next victim?
Now, one man stands accused.
If police are right and Edwards is the Claremont serial killer, he's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years.
Today, prosecution posed the question: did the accused Claremont serial killer take trophies from the bodies of Jane Rimmer and Ciara Glennon? Hi everyone, Natalie Bonjolo, Tim Clark and Alison Fan with you again today for day 89 of Claremont in Conversation. Tim, Justice Hall started the day's proceedings by asking the exact same question that we were asking ourselves in last night's podcast about this RH17.
Yes, and it confirmed to me that I wasn't going mad, and I remembered properly, because Justice Hall, being Justice Hall, did his due diligence last night, went back through the transcript of Miss Barbagallo's opening and did come to the same conclusion that we had, that we'd heard that it was originally put that piece of hair was cut by someone at the crime scene, but at the discovery of the body and not at the crime scene when the crime was being committed, which is what Miss Barbagallo had suggested yesterday. There's confusion all around, but Miss Barbagallo was quite clear again that, no, Your Honour, our suggestion is that piece of hair was cut and was separate from the body when the body was discovered, and it was just pristine. Not even anyone at the crime scene had to cut it. So, yeah, that cleared up that little mystery, but what Justice Hall makes of it all in the end is obviously yet to be determined.
And another thing that Ms Barbagallo queried right off the bat this morning was this inference yesterday that Bradley Edwards intended, in fact, to kill the young woman he raped at Karrakatta.
Yeah, and we discussed that last night because it was the first time we'd ever heard it. And Justice Hall returned to it, as you said, Nat, straight off the top this morning, just clarifying really what Ms Barbagallo was trying to infer and getting it clear in his mind exactly what he should make or what he could make of that inferral. And I would say Ms Barbagallo backed away a little bit from what she said yesterday, in that she said it was open to him to infer that, but they weren't relying on it as a proof, if you like, or something that should be found in fact. What Ms Barbagallo said was, well, look, we were putting it to get out in front of the arguments that the defence might make. If that is put to Your Honour by the defence, then this is what we say about it. If it's not put by the defence, then you can still consider it, but it's not something that we say is crucial to find as a matter of fact, or as something that is in turn crucial to our case. So look, it's still out there, and it's still being said, so obviously we're still going to report on it and talk about it, but whether it comes to a real crunch, if you like, but once again we'll have to see what Justice Hall makes of it all.
So again, this is really this tactic of leaping ahead, anticipating what the defence is maybe going to say and trying to cut them off at the pass before they even get there.
She's probably anticipating a little bit too much, because Justice Hall is asking her question after question. He's asking her clarification, he's asking explanation. I've never heard so many questions as today. It certainly wasn't smooth sailing for the prosecutor, because she was pulled up time after time by Justice Hall today, asking her why she's saying that, clarify that. And a couple of times, especially as what we were talking about last night, because he said after he'd gone back and looked at the opening, he was quite adamant that could be seen as unfair. I think he's also thinking the defence might come in and say, well, look, we find that submission that you put in your closing address, it wasn't in your opening address, and I'm talking about the hair being cut, that he might say, well, I wanted an opportunity to ask some of the expert witnesses about that. So I think also probably the reason behind so many questions is that Justice Hall is also anticipating any grounds for appeal that the defence might lodge, because he was certainly very, very vocal today.
So, I mean, the both of you would have sat in on literally hundreds, probably thousands of closing submissions in your time. Is it unusual for a judge to interrupt closing arguments like this?
No, but that's because he's sitting on his own, so he doesn't have to sort of worry about what the jurors might think about or interpret his questions. Normally, if there's a jury there, the judge is very, very careful, and only at the very end might, in his final instructions, tell them not to take so much notice about this particular fact and not to take so much, interest in that. He'll instruct them, but because he's on his own, he's asking the questions that she's putting to him, and there are a heck of a lot of questions.
And Tim, as a journalist, are you reading into those questions?
Well, yeah, I mean, you have to, because that is obviously the line of reasoning and the questions and the theories that Justice Hall is obviously considering and contemplating as these closing submissions are being rolled out and these theories are being rolled out. They're raising questions in his mind, and he is raising them as we go, if you like. To go to Ali's point, they're not unusual to ask questions, but the amount of questions and the weight of these questions to me is quite unusual. But
it began right off the top, didn't it? I mean, that's why she didn't get through her. I think she thought she was going to get through today, but the first 20 minutes or so of today was asking her to clarify what she said in her closing submissions about the hair that she didn't say in the opening. And he did say that could be seen as unfair. So I think a lot of the interruptions did delay her finals. She thought she was going to wrap up today, and I think towards the end when he said, "You're not going to take how long are you going to take?" She said, "Oh no, I'll be going into it tomorrow."
Okay, so she ploughed on and detailed all the similarities, I guess, between Jane and Ciara's disappearance and the similarities between the discovery of their bodies. Tim, what was her key points in that area?
Well, there were many and varied, Nat, and she said because there are so many similarities, then ultimately her conclusion, and she says the conclusion that Justice Hall should draw, is that Ciara and Jane were murdered by the same person. And she said from that, you can then go further and say that person must have been Mr. Edwards. And yeah, there were lots of them. We heard about the wounds again today in quite graphic detail. We heard about the wounds on the neck, which Ms. Barbagallo said were more than likely what killed both women. Then we heard about the defensive wounds and the fact that they were in similar places on the body, on the left arm of Jane and the right arm of Ciara. We heard about the fact that there were items missing from both bodies. Jane, we know all her clothes were missing, plus some personal items, including jewellery. For Ciara, we heard that some of her clothes were missing, her jacket and other personal items, including her bag. They were missing. And as you said, right off the top, Nat, Miss Barbagallo speculated or postulated, could the killer, in this case Mr. Edwards, have been taking trophies? That could never be concluded conclusively, but she floated it, she put it out there. And then there were all the other similarities that we've talked about. The fact that both girls went missing from Claremont on a weekend night. They were alone, they were on foot, and then their bodies were discovered relatively equidistant from Perth, 40 kilometres or so, in semi-rural areas. The fact that they weren't buried, that they were overground, that their bodies were covered with flora and fauna taken very close, apparently, to the dump sites. And so she said, you put all that together, the conclusion must be, the inference must be that they were killed by the same man. And then she said, you go to the DNA and the fibres which physically link both victims, and you can then draw the conclusion that they were in Mr. Edwards' car and killed by Mr. Edwards because of the Telstra workwear link, which is where those blue fibres are said to come from.
Yeah, and she also touched on the screams that were heard in the various areas as well, and she went back through that in quite detail too. Again,
Justice Hall questioned quite closely the screaming and what that might have had to do with anything. He was, whether he was playing the devil's advocate or what, I don't know, but he really didn't accept a lot of the stuff that she said about Sarah Spears. He said, well, one minute you say that the attackers caught them and that there was no evidence with Sarah, that if she was screaming, it was because she wasn't attacked suddenly. So he did go into that. I found it quite interesting and compelling, the questions he was asking about that.
So, Tim, just explain, I guess Justice Hall was really questioning the propensity here when he was talking about the Karrakatta victim who didn't have the opportunity to scream.
Yes, so, I mean, that was one of the theories, I suppose, or the questions that he tested with Ms. Barbagallo in terms of, well, we know the Karrakatta rape victim was gagged, she was hooded, and she was not really given the opportunity, if you want to think of it that way, to defend herself and to scream because she was tied up and because she was incapacitated the way she was. But then he juxtaposed that, I suppose, with the evidence about the screams at Wellard, and he questioned, well, if that was an attack, was it the same type of attack in all aspects that had happened at Karrakatta? And then, as Ali just mentioned, when it came to the screams in Mosman Park that were heard, which Ms. Barbagallo said should be taken as the final moments of Miss Spears's life, possibly. Again, there was vigorous questions around that in terms of, well, the opportunity to scream. So was she alive at Mosman Park? It would appear she was because of the screams. But then what happened after that? And the differences again were drawn out by Justice Hall in saying, well, how did Sarah even end up in Mosman Park if that's where she was intending to go, which we know was because of the call that she made to the taxi? If it was Mr. Edwards, did he intend to drop her off? Was he playing, nice in terms of taking her to an intended destination and then attack her? And if he did, and if that is the theory, then that again is slightly different to Jane and Ciara, who would appear to have been taken to a remote location and then killed there. So there were, as Ali said, there was vigorous questioning and highlighting of the subtle differences between all these crimes, alleged crimes, and Justice Hall saying, well, if those differences are what they appear to be, then is that going to be a problem for me to conclude that they were all crimes committed by the same person?
Yeah, and I guess it was interesting because this really is the first time we've heard Sarah Spears mentioned in the closing arguments. Did Ms. Barbagallo give an account of Sarah Spears, her theory of her last moments like she did for Jane and Ciara?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. She went through everything with Sarah, right through everything that we've heard from the various neighbours in that area that heard her screaming, from what she was doing that day. But I don't know. The judge just didn't. He seemed to knock her back on just about everything she was saying. It was, I thought, very unusual. But he did go through point by point. But you're saying that this has happened and that happened. Why did she stop? It was, to me, very. I could see Don Spears, Sarah's father, with his head down at one stage in the front row of the court, whether he was thinking the same thing as I was, that maybe because there's been no body found, that the judge does need to be convinced beyond reasonable doubt that Badly Robert Edwards, in fact, did all three.
Tim, what was your interpretation of that?
Yeah, I thought it was quite telling, some of the points that Justice Hall was raising, because it was illustrative and indicative of the thought process and the process that he's going to have to go through to come to a conclusion. And particularly when we got to the portion this afternoon of the closings that did relate to Ciara, there was, as I said previously, vigorous questioning. And on top of what Ali's just said, he even questioned the timeline. So we know that Ciara made the call at just after 2 o'clock to get the taxi. She was gone within minutes, according to the witnesses. Then the screams were between 2:30 and 3 o'clock. And Justice Hall asked the question quite openly, well, does that give Mr. Edwards enough time to do what you say he's done? Because he was at work at 8 o'clock the following morning.
Yes,
So that gives a very, as Justice Hall postulated, quite a tight window for him to have done what he has done, picked her up, taken her to Bosman Park, then apparently killed her, dumped her somewhere, well, if you want to put it that way, that her body's never been found, and then can be at work at 8 o'clock. And then he pointed out
the Ciara Glennon one, yeah.
Well, I was going to say the Telstra Living Witness evidence, because Ms. Barbagallo said one of the main points we say, and one of the main reasons we say that you can find that Mr. Edwards killed Ciara was the other accounts from these 4 key Telstra Living witnesses who all talked about having strange encounters with this Telstra car in 1996. One of those was on less than 24 hours, or almost exactly 24 hours after Ciara went missing. And so Justice Hall again raised the question, well, if he's done what he's done in the early hours of the 27th, then gone to worked a 12, 14-hour shift, and then gone out again, Mr. Edwards could have hardly have slept in that whole period. Is that possible? Is that something that I have to take into account? And the mere fact that he's raised the question in court would say that he is going to take that account, or he's certainly going to consider it when he's considering the possibility that Mr. Edwards has done count 6, which is Ciara's murder.
And what was Ms. Barbagallo's response to that when he says to her, how is this possible, and do I need to take this into account, this window of time?
Well, Ms. Barbagallo was quite strong. She said, absolutely, there is time to do it. And the reason we say you can find that is the Karrakatta situation, the Karrakatta incident, where the young lady was taken off the street, got bound, gagged, driven around, attacked, then dumped again, all in a very short window. So Ms. Barbagallo's phraseology was ruthless, efficient, calculating, and he had the skills to do this, and he's shown that he's done this before, and he's admitted that he's done this before. So, but in that incident, obviously, there was no dumping of any body remotely. The body, or the victim in that case, was dumped on site, if you like, and left at the cemetery. So her response was as strong as the questioning. In she says yes, there was ample time to have done that in Ciara's case, and in the other cases as well.
And Ali, you mentioned in the case of Ciara Glennon, we know that there is basically a 10-hour window in which the state says that Mr. Edwards murdered Ciara. Did Justice Hall also raise that issue and that time there?
Well, yes, he did, and he questioned again that if Ciara Glennon went missing in the early hours of that morning, then was seen at the time that the witnesses saw her getting into the car, was then driven to Eglinton, maybe not straight away, but afterwards. Then did he have time to come back and drive down to the Mandurah-Dawesville area to catch up with his friends who he was meant to have dinner with the night before, but gave an excuse. And according to the wife of that man, he said he arrived around about mid-morning, 10:30. So he queried the timing of all of that. Did he have time to bury her? And the prosecutor said, well, of course, it wasn't. He didn't dig a grave. He just pulled branches off and covered her. So it wasn't like he'd spent any time digging, burying the body. It was just left. But he was actually questioning the timing of that. Back then, 1996, 97, we didn't have the freeway. I'm not sure. Yeah, that's what it was. That I thought that was, again, quite interesting, the questions that he was asking.
And Tim, this also really led to what Ms. Barbagallo basically sort of described by the end of the day as Mr. Edwards' MO.
Yes, his modus operandi. And so, she brought all the strands together. So, including the Telstra living witness and the sightings of the car that listeners might remember. For Sarah's scream sequence in Mosman Park, one of the witnesses got up, looked to where he thought the screams had come from, and saw this light-coloured station wagon, as he described it, near the phone box in Claremont. So there was that. There was the Telstra living witness, all involving a white car, and then the sightings of the white car again by the many witnesses who think they saw Ciara on her last walk up Stirling Highway. So she brought all that together and said, there, if you look at it all together, we have a picture of a man trawling through Claremont, looking for victims. The way she described it was he making an opportunity for himself to find these lone women, these vulnerable lone women, and that was his MO, that he would go out in his car, find these women, either abduct them and put them in his car or lure them into his car through the offer of a lift, and then commit the crimes that he's committed. So that's what she did urge and will urge again, I'm sure, Justice Hall, to find that these three murders weren't isolated, because you have Karrakatta and you have the Telstra living witness again, which takes it to 8 at least sightings of a car around Claremont. And then she pointed to the other Telstra living witnesses, which were not as strong for her theory, but she still said could be taken into account, because again, they were, if not exactly similar, certainly similar in varying characteristics, to show that this is what Mr. Edwards was spending his nights doing in the mid-90s.
And was there any discussion about the fact that Sarah Spear's body wasn't found?
Well, this is why I think Justice Hall has got to be convinced beyond reasonable doubt, because there's no DNA or fibres or anything like the other two that relate to Sarah Spears, only the screams in Mosman Park, and that's why I believe he was questioning so closely every step of the way how she ended up in Mosman Park, etc. So he's got a problem with when there's no body, I think that will be a very interesting exercise in how he comes back with that particular case.
Yeah, and that was an interesting legal manoeuvre that Miss Barbagallo pulled today. So when she got to that portion of her closings, she said to Justice Hall, we say this is the intellectual route, the intellectual journey you should take to find that Mr. Edwards guilty of Sarah's murder, in that you should look at Jane and Ciara's first, even though they happened later in time. Because we have the bodies and because we have the physical evidence, or because we have the DNA, she says you should look at those first. And if you then find that Mr. Edwards killed both Jane and Ciara, then you go to Sarah's murder, and then you look at all the circumstances surrounding that, the similarities surrounding that, and the absence of the body then should not preclude you from finding him guilty because of all those other similarities. And I'm wondering, almost anticipating Mr. Jovich will have a bit to say about that, because the propensity...
Well, we've already heard, haven't we? He's going to go longer than we thought he was.
Well, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So that says to me he's going to have plenty to say, full stop. But I'd be interested to see what he has to say about this, because it's a sort of reverse propensity. Because if you take the crimes in the order that they happened, then obviously Sarah's first. But so will it be possible for Justice Hall to reverse that propensity and look at Jane and Ciara first, and then go back in time, if you like, and say, well, if he's done it there, then he could have done it here, and it'll be an interesting, steps of logic for him to take if he can do that, and then if he does do that, in fact.
Yeah, and I mean, you can't help but wonder how the Spears family are feeling through all of this right now. And you mentioned, Ali, that at one point, Don Spears had his head down and he must have been thinking this is not necessarily going to include his daughter.
Well, because no matter what the outcome of this trial, their ordeal is not over, is it? With her never being found.
That's right.
So that's the tragedy of this whole thing. While we're listening to it, they still don't have any resolution as to where her body is.
Was there any reaction from Bradley Edwards in court today?
No, I don't see any reaction. I just see the same man. As I said, just a couple of times he looked over. He seems to be a little bit more animated, but I don't know if that's just my imagination or not. I was watching him during some of the points that were being argued between the judge and the prosecutor, but he seemed to perk up a little bit at that. But apart from that, no, I don't see him having much reaction either way.
Is he still taking as many notes as he did, Tim?
I don't think he's taking notes. I think he's doodling. Because do you ever see him turn the page, Tim?
No, I'm not sure. We can't see over the dock, and those scribbles, whatever they are obviously never likely to be made public. But no, as Ali said, quite phlegmatic. Not really any emotion either way, either good or bad to what he's hearing. But we'll see whether there is any emotional.
When his lawyer gets up.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. So obviously, as you've mentioned, Carmel Barbagallo has gone longer than expected. What is there left to cover off on the prosecution's case?
Well, she's going to put forward another logical journey that the judge might be able to take. She says the one I've just described, she says, is the one we say you should take. But if you can't be satisfied with that, there is another way around it, and that is to look at all the similarities again. So we'll probably go through that in the morning. She will cover off on the interview, I would imagine, and the lies that Mr. Edwards told there. She might be leaving that to the end to try and get the maximum impact out of that portion. So yeah, she has got a fair way to go yet, but we are now fully anticipating that she will finish tomorrow, and then as we said, it'll be Mr. Jovich's turn. And one of my media colleagues took the opportunity to ask Mr. Jovich how long he thought he might be, and he was quite emphatic in saying he doesn't actually think he might finish this week. So
wow.
we might go on into days 94 and 95,
That's
however
right.
long it might be. But as Justice Hall said yesterday, there's an infinite amount of time. He's not going to put any pressure on anyone to finish to a deadline. And the one thing that's left to do then, or there's a couple of things, there'll be legal portions of the law that Justice Hall will sort of tell himself that he has to pay attention to while he's reaching his verdict, and he will ask both sides about their opinion on those. And then there are also the actual facts that Mr. Edwards will be sentenced on in terms of the Karrakatta rape. And it might sound a bit of an anathema to ask the man that's done these things what he agrees that he did, but that is the legal process that they will have to go through because Justice Hall will have to come to a series of facts and quite detailed facts on that when it comes to sentencing. So So there might be some argument around how that process is going to conclude itself as well. So yeah, still a fair way to go.
Just when we thought we knew we were moving towards the end, it's going to stretch out that little bit longer. And I think the intensity of the closing arguments so far, certainly I have found quite surprising.
Well, yeah, it has, Nat, because obviously we're trying to condense nearly 7 months of evidence into 2 or 3 days of closing submissions. So it is quite dense. There is a lot to take in. There are a lot of theories and arguments and legal questions that are being put. But as we've said all along, it needs to be done this way, so we can ultimately come to the right verdict or a just verdict at the very least.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you both so much for all your hard work, and thanks everyone for your feedback. We're getting plenty of emails and questions, which we will try to answer in coming weeks. But for now, join us tomorrow when Mr. Jovic will launch his closing arguments. That's day 90 of the trial and day 90 of Claremont in Conversation. Talk to you then.
This podcast is hosted by Natalie Bongiolo, produced by Kate Ryan, and recorded in the studios of 7 West Media. Sign up for daily emails and all the latest on the Claremont trial at thewest.com.au. And if local news delivered differently appeals to you, tune into WA's newest morning show, The West Live with Jenna Clark. It's talkback radio, but without the interruptions. Listen live weekdays from 8:45 a.m. on thewest.com.au or catch up with the podcast.